Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Roja Mutaya Library. Welcome also to the fourth Professor M. Anandakrishnan Memorial Lecture. To me, Professor Anandakrishnan is one of the finest educationists produced, not only nearly in Madras but in India. I got to know him when he was Vice Chancellor of Anna University, and he was setting up the Department of British Technology there, and he was very helpful at that time. Later he became the Vice Chancellor at that time. Later he became Director of IIT Kanpur, and but to me the most significant work, and he's still Director of IIT Kanpur, the most significant work is the work he has done on something which I don't get involved in at all, but it is making Tamil part of the computer language. And this was a sort of multinational project. Malaysia, Singapore, Ceylon and all wherever Tamil was spoken. They all had different views on how to get it, and he managed to get them all together to make Tamil computer friendly, and that basically was done being used all over the Tamil computers as such. I think it's the most significant work he did. He happens to be a fellow trustee of mine at the Roja Mutaya Library and makes very significant contributions here. In many ways, the best contribution has been this endowment series of lectures. The Roja Mutaya Library goes back quite a while. It goes back to a man called Roja Mutaya. The Roja, rose, coming from his logo of his signs which they painted. He was a sign painter. He began a sign painting business in Madras, and the logo on it was the rose. And he became a collector of originally, not really of books and things like that, but he really started magpie collector, letters, stamps, anything with connected, basically started with collecting people, Chettias overseas, wedding invitations and a whole lot of things like that. And then gradually began to collect books. Those days there were a lot of pamphlets coming out, and a variety of literature which was sold inexpensively on the streets, street literature. Began collecting all this. Gradually began to go into books and other books and so on and so forth. And he built up a magnificent collection in Madras, but then found no space to keep it in Madras. So he took it to his village in Kottayu, and like big large houses which he looked at this morning, and he used the house to run this collection as a one-man show. Then when he was growing old and the children did not look like doing anything with this collection as far as he knew, he began to look for buyers. It was a magnificent collection used very, not sadly, not by Indian students, but by foreigners from Japan, from the US, from UK. They used to come to Chetna just to use this collection on a variety of material. Looking for a buyer, he found all good Chettias, like good Chettias, wanted to value every postcard with a price. And you can't put a price to a postcard, you can't put a price to a stamp, you can't put a price to a pamphlet, so on and so forth. So eventually it had to make somebody, one of them, Lakshmi, who was researching something there, informing Ramanujan at the University of Chicago that this collection was there. Nobody knew what was happening with it. And the University of Chicago then decided to buy the collection. And they bought the collection, and then I think very generously, they agreed to leave the collection in India with a trust. This was in 1994. What they insisted on was that everything should be, those days, microfilm, digitized, and sent back to Chicago. But the collection could remain here permanently. And they provided all the equipment also for microfilming on those days, and that's how Roja Mutaya Research Library started with the trustees. Today we are the second lot of trustees who run the place as such. And unfortunately, for the Roja Mutaya Library, the agreement with Chicago University has now run out this year. They've got all the material that we were promised to do, though they still help us out. But then we have to find our way on our own. So anybody got rupees 2.5 crores, we gladly accept it from you. Because that's what we're looking at for purpose. Keep this running. Anybody have any ideas, you could let us know how we get 2.5 crores. But otherwise, it still runs very successfully. One is a research center where we have about 100 people coming for research every year. It's probably the most accessible research center in the class that you will find, from the friendliest staff and so on and so forth. There are magnificent collection of Bhakti literature, Ayurvedic material, Siddarth material, medieval material, film collections, film literature and so on and so forth. So the variety of material in Tamil here, which researchers use now quite profusely as such. But we don't really charge much for research work here, and we accept collections, but money is a big problem in the sense of how to keep going. Because unless you get big money, there's no point to the Xerox copy at 3 rupees a copy or something, not going to keep this place running. So I think we have to find ways and means, and any ideas would be welcome. Our friend Victor must have ideas. He tend to go around in America and collect a few money, a few dollars for that. So one thing we do is we run exhibitions once a month at least, and one lecture at least every month. And that's what makes us a little more careful in the public eye, except those who are researching material who know where to come here and find a well-developed. So please feel welcome to come here. Welcome this evening to this lecture by Siddarth on a fascinating subject of old Mysore. And may I ask Vikram, where would you come and introduce Siddarth?
But since Sundar asked me, I myself am sort of somewhat new, and actually I appreciate the history you just gave us, because I think lots of people are curious to know how this magnificent archival center and research institute developed. I only found out about it fairly recently from my friend who is in the Indian Embassy in Washington, who insisted that this is the place to really be active if you are here in Madras or Chennai and looking for something to do of an intellectual nature. Now, Siddarth, who's the speaker this evening, I'm sort of sandwiched between, in a way, the great presentation that Mr. Mutaya gave and what promises to be a great presentation that Siddarth gave. I have known him for now more than 2 decades, having been his classmate. So it's a little hard to read out his own official biography, but I think I may have to do that also, since it's being videotaped and I can't say anything off the record. So Siddarth has a distinguished academic record, having obtained a BA Honours from the National Law School of India University, where he was a gold medalist, and later obtained, following his graduation from the National Law School, obtained an LLM in International Law from the University of Warwick Law School, where he was a Foreign and Commonwealth Chevening Scholar and a J.N. Tata Scholar, both at once, so successful. Siddarth was is currently a visiting professor at our alma mater, the National Law School in Bangalore, and at the Jindal Global Law School outside Delhi. He has been a visiting faculty member teaching business and commercial law subjects at the Department of Management Studies at the Indian Institute of Science, and he also teaches at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, where he specializes on the subjects he specializes in, even though your biography doesn't say what those are. Currently, he's working on a PhD, which is news to me, on the legal and administrative structures of the princely state of Mysore, which is through the biographical prism of which I get the subject of this presentation, Sir Albion Banerji, is viewed, right? So What is not mentioned here though, and if I may have the liberty of saying, since it's also a advertisement for you, is that Siddarth, in the great tradition of Mr. Mutaya and his sort of mentee, Sriram, who's not here today, has pioneered a series of walks in Bangalore, especially around his neighborhood, Nandi Hills, where he shows you how Cornwallis came and how he went to Mysore. I've always maintained Madras has a lot more history than that, but I'm glad that you still do what you do in Bangalore with the little that you have, and I have not been on these walks because they are too early on a Sunday morning for me to wake up and go all the way. But I encourage all of you to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you, Mr. Sundar, for the opportunity to be here this evening. I am actually quite overwhelmed, I must tell you, because there's a lot here that I've tried to do, but there's perhaps a lot undone still, actually, which I'm hoping to complete in the course of my PhD. So, actually, the problem, what I'll do is I'll probably speak for about 45-50 minutes. Actually, probably my session itself, the number of slides I have. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me even without this? No? Okay. Hello? Can you hear me now? No, I prefer to be here. So, I'll probably speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. I'm happy to do that. So, actually the first issue that I came up with when I was exchanging correspondence with Mr. Sundar was to come up with a topic for this lecture here in Madras. And I took a little bit of liberty in calling it shaping of relations. We'll come to that in the little latter part of the presentation. I don't necessarily think it's a shaping of relations actually, if you look at it. But, let's just dive straight in. Oops, sorry. So that's the gentleman who I am looking at for my, my research. I'm looking at the old princely Mysore. His full name is Sir Albion Banerji. And he was roughly 79 when he passed away. And so what brought me to him? Well, in 3 words, the Kaveri water system. Now, so that's one context set for this evening. The shaping of the relations between the princely state of Mysore on the one hand and the paramount power of the British. I've taken the liberty of looking at some aspects of the Madras presidency as well over here. So that's only one facet. So what got me to it was when I was reading in the course of my legal research, I came across the 1924 Kaveri Waters Agreement, signed on the 18th of February 1924 by P. Hawkins, Secretary to the Government Public Works Department, and A.R. Banerji, Diwan of Mysore. So that's what's intrigued me now. Who is or who was this A.R. Banerji? And the more I dig, the more interesting and intriguing the complicated the story becomes actually. And Mysore is only one part of that story. So I'm using biography and some background to my research on this. I'm using biography as an attempt to be a prism, not just on his life and times, but also on the issues and the events he was involved in, right? And senior professors have said that his biography is the stepchild of history. And I don't know whether it's relevant or not, perhaps just it's appropriate, I would say. Doesn't quite cut the mustard. Since I'm talking about a Bengali, I think that's perhaps pretty appropriate to talk about cutting the mustard. Now, the problem with biography is that, as Professor Bauman talks, it can too easily privilege the individual, narrate rather than analyze, and provide an outlet for authorial ego. Right? So that's what I'm looking at. Now, but listen, I grew up with biography in Bangalore. And so why can't its trajectory be made part of mainstream history? Right? Now, the first biography I ever read was Stanley Walcott's Jinnah of Pakistan when I was 14. And I've always been interested in biography. And I said, why can't we approach someone like A.R. Banerji in that light? Sorry, this is a little bit of a longish quote. It comes from Ramchandra Goa, in his book, The Makers of Modern Asia. So let's read that to you. Biography is a study of an individual in his or her context. The life illuminates the times and vice versa. An individual's credo and career are most effectively recreated when he or she is seen as the center of a constellation of forces and persons. And historians are now discovering the potential of using an individual life to explore wider social and political processes. Much depends, and these are points which I think are central to my tools, on the methods of the historian, his or her zest for primary research, his or her analytical and literary skills, commitment to scholarly depth, and eschewing mere sensationalism. Much also depends on the nature of the subject and the importance of the subject. And yet, if scholar and subject are properly matched, biography can be a productive and often very illuminating window into history. So I think there's some critical points there. Context, life and times of a person, it's relative to others and to circumstances, and you're trying to discover wider issues, right? Primary research is your tool, analysis, depth, impact, even if unimportant, and most importantly, avoiding this mere sensationalism or trying to put a halo around someone, the subject covered in biography. So that was what set me off, and I actually saw this a few years ago, and there was something else which set me off on this course. And I came across this, I don't know if some of you have read this book, it's called The King in Exile, The Fall of the Royal Family of Burma, by a lady called Sudha Shah, who took 8 years to put it together. And believe it or not, I was reading this on an aircraft once, it's a Jet Wings magazine, and I think this kind of stuck in my mind. If you can do meticulous research, for someone who's never done it before, you can narrate a story, and you keep the reader engrossed in the travels of, in this case, a foreign monarch of no great importance. And I'm of course not dealing with an incident, because this was about the fall of the royal family of Burma in the late 19th century. And I'm dealing with a career, but it's something that struck me right away, that it's a person who's not necessarily of great consequence, A.R. Banerji. So that's what I've done so far. I've actually traveled through, and I'll come to why I went to Bristol to look at records over there. I've looked at some of the records in the Oriental and India Office Collection, the fantastic British Library in London, and some of the National Archives, and I'm now starting with the State Archives and Persian papers, primarily in Mysore. I'll get to Madras, I'm sure, soon enough. And I'm looking at older, accounts of history. So I must begin with a caveat like a good lawyer. My current stage of research on this is largely primary. Now the reason I say that is that it could lead to a skewing of the research, in that you only see one side of this history and not necessarily the full story. And I'm beginning to find that with archives, it's more than what you find, it's how they go into the archives and what's the reason for them to be placed there, which is important. So that's the kind of basis to my work. If I could say that this last few slides was about the basis to my work. Right, so who is Sir Albion Rajkumar Banerji? First of all, just to get the various titles out of the way: Companion of the Order of the Indian Empire, awarded in 1911 as Diwan of Cochin, Companion of the Order of the Star of India as First Councillor of Mysore, Knight Bachelor in the Birthday Honours List of the King in 1925, and an ICS officer who retired in 1922 at the start of his career, of his Diwanship in Mysore. Now, why did I begin by going to Bristol? Because Sir Albion Rajkumar Banerji was born in Bristol in 1871. This is a record which I pulled out a few years ago, which you can clearly see. October 1871, 10th of October, Red Lodge House, Park Row, Albion Rajanmar. They got the name slightly wrong. That's the father's name, Sasi Pada, and the mother's name is actually Rajkumari Banerji, formerly Ghoshal, government clerk in Calcutta, and this is the house, Red Lodge House, Park Row, Bristol, and that's the date of the recording of the actual birth records of the city of Bristol. Now, the first thing which struck me, and this is the first context why I think, is the name of that house, Red Lodge House, Park Row, Bristol. I don't know if anyone of you have been to Bristol. It's the family house of this lady and her father. It's a little bit of a quiz here probably. That is Land Carpenter and her daughter, and his daughter, Mary Carpenter, the well-known English educationist of the 19th century, key to bringing education to the girl child in this country. And the reason they were there, remember, born in 1871, of parents, Shashipada Banerji and the mother Rajkumari. And my record for this, that's the anglicized, Buranagar. Buranagar is Baranagar, which is just outside. And those days it was a little locality just north of Calcutta. I think it's now truly well part of Calcutta. And this, by the way, is from the Bristol Records Office that I managed to source. It's a book written by Mary Carpenter when she came visiting India in 1866. Published in 1868. It's a fascinating little account of the parents of Albion Banerji. And the key reason that they were there is one word: Brahmo Samaj. Shashipada Banerji was one of the most influential Brahmo Samajists of his day. And this is a very interesting little account about how she came visiting Baranagar in December 1866. And talks about, the fact that she was meeting the man and his wife, and the devotion. Of course, the critical aspect about it is Brahmo, which is this whole Western idea, right? The Western influence, and you can see immediately many of them starting being accused of being more than actually they're not Hindu. And the reason for this, or part of this, was another word which caught my attention, that is excommunication. Right? These are Bengali Brahmins who were expelled for doing things not permitted by Orthodox society in those days, which is basically things like girl child education, etc. It's a very interesting little account again about how the interaction between Mary Carpenter and the Banerjis in 1866, 1868. So you have the husband-wife team actually moving across the seas. Okay, keep that in mind. And it's the lady going across to London, to England in 1871. Most of the records that I have been able to track suggest that she was the first Brahmin lady ever to visit the UK. And he was born as a result in Bristol. And hence the name Albion, which is the old word for the British Isles. It's also, incidentally, the name of the oldest port in England, which is in Bristol. It's called the Albion Dockyards. From not very far from Red Lodge House, which is today the official residence. It's a museum maintained in honor of the Carpenters, Mary and Land Carpenter. Land Carpenter, by the way, was present at the funeral of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, because that's the other famous connection with Bristol. Raja Ram Mohan Roy is buried in Bristol. He lies in the Arnsvale Cemetery in Bristol. So that's the first connection. Now, several years later, Albion Banerji wrote a book about his father, right? And you could see the influence. You see the Marquess of Zetland, who just then, I think, was Secretary of State for India in 1934, who actually, and there's a fantastic little account of how the family grew up. He grew up with several step-brothers, half-brothers, and half-children who almost all of them died before they could attain majority. So Banerji comes back after he was born a few years in the UK, and then, after studying at the Scottish Church College in Calcutta, founded by Reverend Duff, which is still there today, and the Presidency College Calcutta, he comes to, that by the way is Oxford. That's the Holy Cross Church of the Balliol College, Oxford. That's the Archives Division. I managed to sneak a photograph of myself in there against the archives and the records. The reason I'm there is because in 1893, at the age of 22, Albion Banerji travelled again across the seas, go back to England to write the Civil Services Examination of 1894. And that is some stuff that I got off. That's actually the entire syllabus for the year is noted, and I'll come to that in a minute. Now, this is a time when the English had introduced an examination for the first time for the civil services, and there were several commissions going into that. And the commission which has a direct impact on what I am doing is 1889, which is not a very clear photograph. And some of the points which struck me was, so it was, they felt that there was a suggestion to hold an examination in India, as well in Calcutta, as well as in London, but they found that to be inexpedient. And recruitment in India for the civil service is undesirable. And there would be no lowering of the standard of the distinctively English character of the examination. And the age was fixed between 19 and 23. And probationers who would go across would have to spend 1 year, which is why in 1893-1894, Albion Banerji spent a year at the Balliol College in Oxford. Sorry, again a clear quiz question. The two most well-known masters, that is Benjamin Jowett, master of Balliol College, and this, by the way, is Judge Markby, William Markby, who was a judge of the Calcutta High Court for 12 years before going back as reader in Indian law at the Balliol College. Markby was Albion Banerji's guide. This man had set up the whole process of the civil services examination. He was no more. He passed away in the late 1880s. But the two of them were the influential ones setting up the Indian civil service examination. And so in 1894, you have Mr. Banerji, placed 6th amongst candidates selected in 1894 for the presidency of Madras. Right? 34th overall out of 60 candidates, 61 actually, because there was a dropout. And so that gives you his career. MA, Calcutta, Presidency College, Calcutta, Balliol College, Oxford. And those are the subjects they studied in open competition. Mostly, well, there's English law, economic history, all of this is all Western. And in the final exam he ranked 11. And the reason he was assigned to Madras is because he studied Tamil. So there it is. In the open exam for that year, the final exam, he got 338, apart from getting 100% on the riding course. He used to have a horse riding course then. And so at the end of 1894, they get certificated a year later. On the 1st of November 1895, he sets off to India. And there's a little letter which I'll come to in a minute, where he says this: I am an Englishman, having been born in Bristol, and I claim as I have right to do all the rights and privileges of an English subject of Your Majesty. Now the reason for that is a little side story, very interesting story, and it's perhaps illuminative of the nature of the Brahmos, their Western education, torn between Hinduism and Christianity, because a lot of them are branded non-Hindus or in some cases Christian, because of the belief, as I showed you, in one single Lord. Now, the story of Raja Ram Mohan Roy itself is illustrative of this. When he died in Bristol in 1834, he was very clear that he should be buried without ceremony, especially no Christian ceremony, because he didn't want his descendants to face problems that he had died as a Christian. So there is actually a record in the Bristol office which has a single plain sheet of paper where all the witnesses to his burial signed on plain sheets, specifically saying that he was buried without any ceremony and in silence. Now the reason for that is that Banerji discovers that there's a difference in treatment. He finds that there is no fund to which civil servants who are natives of India could subscribe. In other words, Englishmen who were civil servants in India would get a pension fund, but an Indian, native of India, wouldn't. And so then he seeks to establish his legal status. And then it goes on to say, perhaps guided by my Indian name, you feel that I am a native of India, and then makes that statement I showed you. I am an Englishman, because he wants to claim pension. And if no question of domicile can arise in my case, as my parents are by birth British subjects, and he refers to the old criminal procedure code. And even as regards the supposed reason for the rule which ordinarily applies, I beg to submit that though not professing the Christian faith, the community to which I belong, the Brahmos, by the provisions of Act 3 of 1872, make bigamy a crime. Now, Act 3 of 1872 is the old Special Marriage Act of that year, which still, I think, continues in places like Bangladesh. Now, the internal notings on the file are extremely illuminative, actually. They cite classic efficiency considerations and dare say some racism. It says, the exclusion of persons of Asiatic descent, not based solely on the fact that they profess polygamous creeds, but also on the consideration that the actuarial calculations which form the basis of the fund related exclusively to persons of European descent and constitution. So there's some kind of actuarial difference between whether you are an Asiatic descendant or person of European descent. But you know, in classic British officialdom, the ultimate response that is sent to him is, oh, you've already set sail for India, therefore it's no longer Whitehall's problem, let Calcutta deal with it. And so they washed their hands. I still haven't found a reference as to whether he finally got into the pension scheme or not. And perhaps I need to look a little more into the Calcutta records to figure out what happened. Now, so he comes to Madras. Now there's for people in this city at least, I'm sorry, it's not a very good photograph. I actually have, it's the next one. If some of you would recognize this, I don't know. That, by the way, that gentleman over there, it's a very grainy photograph, is Robert William de Esco Ashe, Collector Ashe, who was killed in just outside Tirunelveli. Ashe and Banerji were batchmates. Banerji was 7th, Ashe was 8th. And they were both sent back to the home district, right? They were coming back to the Madras presidency. As I told you, he chose the Madras presidency, chose to do Tamil, and was therefore posted over here. Now so that's a kind of a quick overview of his career in Madras, in the presidency of Madras. Now that is, my source is Thacker's Indian Directory. So you can see it, Assistant Collector Magistrate, Acting Head Assistant Collector, Acting Head Assistant Collector Magistrate, Ramnath, Godavari, Ellore, Tanjore, and so on and so forth. He's all there, all over the presidency. And suddenly, at the age of 36, he gets picked up as the Diwan of Cochin. And there's a reason for that. Okay, before I tell you about that, this, by the way, is the then Maharaja of Cochin, Rama Varma the 15th. And sorry, obviously my Malayalam isn't particular, but he was known as the Voliniya Valya Kampura, meaning the one who abdicated the crown. He was king of Maharaja of Cochin from 1895 to 1914 when he voluntarily abdicated. He was the king of the Cochin state. And the records in London clearly show that the king asked for a thoroughly trustworthy man from British India to be selected. And these are records of the resident in Travancore, Cochin, writing to the government of Madras, asking for the services on deputation of a Diwan. And so they suggest the name, or rather the Maharaja is told to suggest the name of Banerji, now a sub-collector Tanjore. And finally he gets picked, and Hubert Bradley, again writing to Carr, that's from the Madras government, saying Banerji will suit the post very well. It is most creditable to His Highness that he has picked so good a man. And the king, Raja Varma of Cochin, writes back, hope he will be a man with whom I shall be able to work smoothly and satisfactorily, and that he will be able to conduct the administration to the entire satisfaction of my people and the British government. Now, fascinating, these are actual handwritten letters of the king in very nice, neat handwriting. And the king, Cochin king, always used to sign off his letters with the words, believe me. Believe me, yours sincerely or yours faithfully. I just thought it was a new, little interesting little quirk. So he gets picked as Diwan of Cochin state. Now, just to go back a little bit to the Brahmos, right? So, why are they so important in this colonial administration? They were perhaps the first Indians to go overseas under empire, apart from the Christians, right? Breaking taboos. Now, the majority of the first Indian ICS men were Brahmo Samaj movement of Bengal, 18 out of the first 10. The first Indian to enter the ICS was Satyendranath Gaur, the brother of the poet. And then you had the two most important ones, Ramesh Chandra Dutt and, interestingly, Albion Banerji's father-in-law, Krishna Govind Gupta, the second batch of 1871. And Banerji himself writes several years later that we and our predecessors had to struggle against vested interests and prejudices against Indians as to their executive capacity. We were condemned as not being fit for executive posts, and thus the majority of us were relegated to the judicial branch. And so you have only 30 Indians going through. So there is a little interesting side tale here. Now, why was he picked? Partly because he's, apart from his credentials and his fine background, he also is well connected. He is the son-in-law of Krishna Govind Gupta, who was the first Indian member of the India Council in 1907. the Viceroy's India Council, right? And this is him writing about it. He was there, he was finally passed over, he rose to become senior member of the Board of Revenue, and then him, that is Gupta, the father-in-law, and Nawab Syed Hussain Belgrami of Hyderabad, as the first 2 Indian members of the Indian Council. That is his daughter, Nalini Banerji, okay, whom he married in 1988. So you have well-connected in credentials, fine lineage by both birth and by marriage, and he's the first ICS man to be appointed to a divanship. Starting off, what many have then subsequently said is the idea of the travelling divans. The best example of that is the man from this city, Sir CP himself. Right? So there are several travelling divans. This man is a good example. The first divan, the first ICS man to be appointed a divan. I'll quickly skip this. This is a little account about his divanship in Cochin. Now he was there for 7 years. Keep the slide up. Some of you who may know Cochin well will recall that there is a Banerji road just outside the High Court. That is Sir Albion Banerji. And so many people have asked me, and I know that there are accounts of people, Bengalis landing up in Cochin and saying, who's this Banerji over here? That's him. And so there's a lot of good stuff said about Banerji as administrator Diwan in Cochin. You know? And so clearly the fact that he's well connected, he's a son-in-law of a very important man, goes some way. But this is an independent traveller who's a senior civil servant, actually, or retired, who passes through, from what I found out, who passes through the Cochin territory. He says these things, you know, and talks about how he's had the first Brahmo dinner, to watch girls and young men laughing and chaffing with each other, how revolutionary to conservative Indian sentiment. This is 1909, by the way. And then, when I made this last presentation, I said Bengalis used to do well in administration long ago. That might well be true even today. You know, so you have a lot of these references, and Banerji says, "I hope to serve my country, for I look upon India as my country, as England is also my country," and that he may be on the verge of a truly great career. He's called the young Curzonian premier. I don't know if it's particularly apt for Bengali, considering that Curzon had just divided Bengal a couple of years before this, 1905. So this kind of sets the background to him. I'll just spend a minute on this little Bangalore connection over here. Romola Chatterjee used to do a fine job of documenting Bangalore's old bungalows. Is actually Albion Banerjee's niece, and so that's just a little. So that's his Banerji in Bangalore at the old part of the Woodlands Hotel. If some of you might know Bangalore, and that's him, and that's most likely Mrs. Banerjee. Now you see this very distinguished. You can see all the Mysore Petas and all of them, apart from the Englishman, of course. But he's certainly more English than those two men on the other side, right? No Mysore Peta. He's got the hat. This is from Chatterjee's book. Now, before I come to Madras and we talk about Mysore, we'll give you some indulgence. That, by the way, is Albion Banerjee's daughter, Komalata Banerjee, Komalata Dutt. She was a well-known musician, composer, and she set to music, Western classical music. She was trained in Paris and in London, set to Western classical music, a lot of pieces by Rabindranath Tagore. And that one is Anandakrishnan, which was played in 1922-23 by these two people, Uday Shankar and Pavlova. So she collaborated with them. Why am I talking about this? To give you a little context again, I found a connection to Banerjee through Justice Hidayatullah, who was then a judge in Nagpur, because the Dutts, Komalata and her husband Walter Dutt, were in Nagpur, the old CP and Mera court. And he talks about how she was a noted composer and pianist, and her going away was a great loss to Nagpur. In 10 days' time, I'm going to Nagpur to try and dig up some stories about Komalata, because she was head of the Board of Music Studies of Nagpur University. And how it talks about how the husband who lived recklessly, drove recklessly, and spent recklessly. Anyway, so that's on the personal side. So by 1915, what do we have? He's about 45, fine, educated, Brahmin roots, remember excommunicated, steeped in Brahmoism, that is part of the reason for the excommunication, in fact almost all of it. He's Western educated, he maintains a house in London. I know about that for sure, because you can actually find records of him having stayed in London houses. Well connected, a fine officer, a trusted confidant, and a good example of how Indians can govern themselves within the British tradition and influences, but underscoring the paramount power versus the subsidiary state through the subsidiary alliance system, which is the basis for princely India. So in 1915, he demits office as Cochin, in 1914 actually, demits office as Diwan of Cochin and comes back to his principal cadre, ICS office of Madras Presidency, before he is asked for, his services are asked for again on deputation by that man, Diwan Sir Moksharondra Vishweshwaraya. That's him, very young Vishweshwaraya, and that's the king of Mysore. Nalwadi Krishnaraj Wadiyar IV, who was just starting a very flourishing regime of a good for 35 years almost. But let's just step back a bit. Now comes the interesting bit with Madras as well. Now, what's the princely state of Mysore in the British context? Right now, after the British got rid of Tipu in 1799, they restored the Wadiyar dynasty. But for about 30 years, the Mysore administration was conducted, in British language, officially controlled, through Madras, though directed or overseen by the Supreme Government in Fort William, in Calcutta. Now, Bentinck, as Governor of Madras, sought to place Mysore under the direct authority of the Supreme Government in 1804, but it wasn't approved by the Court of Directors of the East India Company. And so, for that 30-year period, you have two gentlemen. This is actually a much older king. This is Mumbadi Krishnaraj Wadiyar III, who was restored by the British in 1799. He was a child and went on to reign for 70 years almost, dying in 1868. And that is Tipu's confidant, who became the Wadiyar's Diwan Kurnain, right? A Brahmin, by the way, from what is today the Coimbatore area. Now, the reason, what happened was, for about 30 years you had the British, or rather the Mysore administration being controlled in this way, until what is called the British resumption in October of 1831. Bentinck, who is now Governor General, issues a formal and final notice of resumption, which is essentially, as I call it here, fine language used to depose the Maharaja. Basically says, we need to assume direct control, because the administration of the state of Mysore is in a mess, there's corruption, and I am sending to you administrators, 2 commissioners for the purpose. Consider this as the notice required by the Treaty of 1799 to be given to your Highness of the measure determined upon for the assumption and management of the Mysore territory in the case of As I said, fine words used to kick the Maharaja out, basically. He remained as a titular figure, but all power passed to the commissioners in Mysore. The first and foremost one was General Sir Mark Cubbon. Again, there was an attempt to transfer Mysore to Madras in 1860, but opposed by both the king and Cubbon. And Canning, who was then Governor General, abandons the effort to transfer Mysore to Madras control in 1860. Several Madras officers are chief commissioners of Mysore, including this man, Lowen Bentham Powing. And right through until what is called the rendition of 1881, Mumbadi Krishnaraj Wadiyar's son, adopted son, Chamarajendra Wadiyar, when he turns 18 in 1881, he is handed back his kingdom. So this is Mysore princely state's unique position amongst princely states. It's perhaps the only princely state that finally emerged in 20th century India, which was for many years, 50 or so years, actually directly run by the British before handing back the administration. Which is why Mysore was held up as being the ideal for all Indian princely states to follow, because it was a British administration that the Mysoreans continued. And so they continued with essentially a subordinate alliance to Her Majesty the Queen and her successors, and the Maharaja is placed in possession of the territories, but no material changes can be made in the administration without the consent of the Governor General in Council. So this is the rendition of 1891. So you resume the office, you resume the territory, and you give it back in 1881. And so the period from 1881 to 1947 represents the true rule of the Wadiyars actually in the modern era, roughly about 60 odd years. A rule dominated by this man, Nalwadi Krishnaraj Wadiyar. Why? The reason I am giving you all of this is because it helps place in context Banerji's role in that whole 8-year period after the war. That's the young king with his regent mother, Mani Vilasa, who ruled for 10 years while he became a major, attained the age of majority. and that's the king all the way to just before he died in 1940 at the age of 56. But the administration was very British, and most of the Diwans who were the fountainhead of the administration were non-natives. So the start of what I call the outsider syndrome, because Mysoreans, especially the Darbar, starts to feel that this is a system of administration imposed upon them, and it's a largely a debate which kind of resolves itself into them versus us, Mysorean versus outsider. Now, why should we have so many outsiders governing and controlling us? And so those are the sampling of some of the Diwans that came. Vishwanath Patankar, Madhav Rao, Tanjore Anand Rao, and Rangacharu, Shetty Punyam, Veeravalli, Rangacharu. Apart from the three great statesmen Diwans, also by the way, apart from Sir Mirza Ismail, who was Mysorean, Vishweshwaraya and Kumarapuram Sheshadri Iyer, who were Diwans. Sheshadri Iyer was the man who helped found the administration of Mysore in the British mold that I'm going to talk about. So this is what happens in 1915 when Albion Banerji comes over as first councillor, effectively Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Diwan. And the man he comes face to face with straight away is the great Mysorean Sir M.V. Mokshagandha Vishweshwaraya. And I pulled out some stuff from the archives in London which show you a completely different perspective. Today Vishweshwaraya is like in Mysore, in Karnataka, is a holy cow. He cannot be touched because he is Bharat Ratna and the statesman, the engineer statesman, etc., etc. But this is what actually happens in 1917, 1918. Remember, the war is just about coming to an end. Mysore is one of the largest supporters of the war, both men and materials. Economy is in ruins, and Vishweshwaraya as Diwan is going ahead in the British view of trying to do crazy things like building a dam across the Kaveri, which he does in 1913, and doing various other things which the British don't like. But also, they want to put him in his place. And these are actual statements that I found from the time. Suddenly, in 1918, suddenly the end of a 6-year tenure, Vishweshwaraya could have continued his demand for 25 more years. He lived until 1962. But he suddenly resigns in December 1918 because of what they call, what the resident in Bangalore writes to his boss in Simla, saying imbroglio. Keep that word in mind, we'll come back to it. But word which I found particularly illuminating. For Sir M. Vishweshwaraya, as I have several times told you, has proved the most difficult Indian to get on with. And quite apart from his suspicious, hasty and touchy personality, I view some of the projects, this is the iron ore scheme, industrialization and Patkal harbour, with undisguised alarm. I do not know whether or not he's going to retire, but should that prove to be the case, one result will be substitution of a more cautious and less bureaucratic policy. Of Sir M. Vishweshwaraya's regime, the motto might be written, pardon my French, I don't know if it's correct, La Etat c'est moi, the state, it is I. And so this is the view on Sir M.V. in 1918. And then he talks about who's going to succeed him. And then comes Banerji and talks about the petulant predecessor. And look at what the British are talking about. The fact that there's muddle, extravagance and inefficiency. And that if Banerji cleans up the whole thing, he'll become the most hated man in Mysore. And that he had told His Highness this in so many words. And something very nice here. Sir M. Vishweshwaraya, an honest man himself as Indian standards go, was an impatient and impractical idealist. And was so wrapped up in his own ambitions, he forgot the everyday work of practical administration. And so we have a situation at the end of the war, where Vishweshwaraya is forced out. And I'll come back to that. The other view, by the way, the non-British view, is this, writing in 41, which is that the successor, Banerji, had neither the power of improvisation nor the practical insights, and he had arrow flights of imagination. And several issues that arise with Vishweshwaraya. Now, I'll skip some of this. There's a lot of criticism about Banerji's administration, especially coming from the local press. Right? This is actually an article in the Hindu by D.V. Gundappa, one of the most well-known Mysore authors. He's talking about how these guys, these people who've come from bureaucracy in India, are there because we don't have much purpose in life as Mysoreans, and that's why he's here. Just as a quick supplement, before Banerji takes over as Diwan of Mysore in 1922, there is another gentleman. If this name in mind. His name is Siddarth M. Kantraj As, who, by the way, is the king's uncle, who was made Diwan for a few years, but he was suffering from what they call a diabetic carbuncle. And the British say that he, neither in brains nor in energy, can be expected to cope satisfactorily with the heavy duties of Diwanship. That's some way to dismiss someone's abilities. So you have this administration of 8 years. Now what's this imbroglio? There's one word which sums it up: reservations. Because in 1920-21, Maharaja of Mysore, with his 2 foot soldiers, Kantrajas and Banerji, focus on the first ever, I think, and I'm probably right in saying this, to introduce reservations into the state card for non-Brahmins. In fact, most Indian authors term the 8-year period from 1918 to 1926 as the heyday of the non-Brahmins. And particularly peeved at this is Vishwesvaraya, who says, if there's no meritocracy, I will quit. And he's forced out effectively. Because and that was also, by the way, a culmination of the British view for his views on Kaveri. And there's a general protest by the Brahmin members of the Representative Assembly, and something that I found very interesting in the National Archives. Now, apart from they linked the reservations issue to the wider agitation. What's happening in 1919 to 21 in wider British India is the first true mass movement, right? After that, civil disobedience movement. So you have a much wider Indian movement. And so the British are finally feeling the pressure of activism in India. And see what they do. This is a British writing again. As I said, part of my research has halted at this, so I need to continue a little more to find the other side. But this is what they say. So the Hindu, this is in 1921, has 3 long articles describing meetings held under the auspices of the Mysore Young Men's Convention. The chief speakers were Mr. Satyamurthy of Madras and S. Kasturiranga Iyengar, editor of the Hindu. The speeches were chiefly interesting in that they attacked the Mysore Darbar and are probably the first real attempt to implant sedition in the state. It is impossible to disconnect them, that's this whole national movement, from the agitation worked by the Brahmins against the Miller Committee report alluded to in my last fortnightly letter. So the British link the fight, the Brahmin response to reservation, to the idea of sedition and the wider national movement which is occurring in India. And of course, they're trying to fish in troubled waters. There's reference to Mohammedans who were the aggressors, and so therefore we cannot regret they're also the chief sufferers. So this is 1921, and it continues, by the way, and it ends up in the constitutional reforms of 1923 in Mysore. Sorry. Yeah. Which is finally, at the end of a period of bringing in reservations, the Mysore Maharaja decides to reconstitute his representative assembly and his legislative council. But the reaction, again, is actually quite muted. And for the first time, not unsurprisingly in light of today's incidents, you see reference from special interest groups coming up. So this is the view that Vishwesvaraya takes. The moment you start bringing in reservations, you will fan the flames of sectional interests. And the Vokkaligas, keep that again in mind. So keep Kantrajas in mind and the Vokkaligas in mind, because I'll come back to that in the context of subsequent to Kaveri. And they want special interests as a special minority representation, and that without such representation they would be disenfranchised. So you see the start of this entire movement happening in Mysore, which is kind of linked to reservations and then linking it to the ousting of Vishwesvaraya, etc. I'll quickly run through this. So this is all about the whole thing. Apart from that, there was also economic issues that Vishwesvaraya had started. He set up the Bhadravati Iron and Steel Works, the first Indian iron and steel plant. But the British are at him again because it was actually a white elephant. And this is from the reports of the British, also by the way borne out by the Mysore records, which is that there was so much of losses, it was causing dissipation of 4.5 crores of cumulative funds on schemes which he left half developed. And so this is the state of affairs in 1924, midway through the Albion Banerji's Divanship. As I said, this is about the thing, but you know the 1922 reforms are significant. Banerji was Divan at the time for this reason. Disqualification for women from exercising franchise was removed. So you had a state assembly where finally women could now vote. They couldn't stand for election, but they could vote in 1922. And things that he should have been given credit for was lost in the overall battle surrounding reservations. There's another little side story here on what is called the assigned tract. We forget that Bangalore, as a cantonment town, should have been Mysore territory, but had been handed over to the British on lease and was the most profitable portion of the Mysore state. And the British only paid an annual lease. And the Mysore administration was saddled with a huge tribute. So there was a double whammy. They were paying a huge tribute to the British. At the same time, they were not getting surplus revenues from the Bangalore assigned tract. Banerji, for the first time, introduces a debate with his British superiors, who are also effectively his bosses from the ICS, saying, either you reduce the treaty obligations and the tribute, or you allow us to offset that against the surpluses, right? So that net we will benefit. 5 years of negotiations, ultimately in 1927, results in both a reduction of the subsidy and an increasing in the lease. But the credit for it is taken by Banerji's successor, Mirza Ismail. And that, by the way, is just a scan which I took from the India Office archives. Those are the number of files just on that subject in the India Office archives in London. Now, Kaveri. I found this an intriguing reference, and this has kind of set me off. Part of the reason why I'm here in Madras is to dig out some of this. Now, this is A.N.L. Carter, the resident in Mysore, writing to his boss again in Simla in February 1924, talking about a contributed article appearing in the Madras Mail on the subject of the Kaveri arbitration dispute, and has something nice to say about Banerji. But there's no words of acknowledgement of Mr. Gebbie's services. Gebbie was a chief consultant to the 1920. He was the chief consulting engineer on the dispute of the Kaveri, which ultimately resulted in the 1924 Kaveri Waters Agreement. And no mention was made of the part played by Mr. C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer or by the residency in that whole process. Right? And the king is so incensed that he sends his private secretary, incidentally, private secretary at that time was Mirza Ismail, to tell him and to say that he thought the article shows bad taste and was calculated to make a laughing stock of the Mysore administration. By this time, Banerji is clearly seen as the outsider. Non-Brahmin, Brahmo, anti-Brahmin, what more did you want from the Dabar? To pick him out as an ideal person to pillory. And so you actually see this. Now, this is a little intriguing because it raised in my mind what happened between these several people. Now, you essentially had, was the 1924 agreement fair and equitable, or was the paramount power forcing a subordinate state? Now, you could say that the outsider in Mysore, Banerji, takes sides with his principal government, Madras presidency. He only resigns from the ICS in 1922, just before becoming Diwan. So at the time of his signing of the agreement as Diwan, he's no longer an ICS officer, but clearly with those ICS roots. Right? That's subtext. And he's seen as this outsider in Mysore. And the Mysore view has always been that the 1924 Kaveri's agreement was unfair. Now that is the basis for the current dispute, because it was the running out of that agreement 50 years later in 1974 that has led to the current situation. Now what did they do in 1924? Now, Madras accepted the final building of the KRS dam and the reservoir and an increase in the height of the dam so that you would have a larger area under irrigation in Mysore. But most importantly, for the fact that it was unfair, was that for the first time Mysore allows the Madras government to build a dam downstream, which results in the Mettur Dam about 10 years later. So that is what is the main grouse of the construction of the Mettur Dam, which is a much larger area under thing. Although there are provisions, incidentally, for Mysore getting rights to bring more territories under its irrigation if Madras increases its rights. It's a complicated issue, and it came up therefore in 1974. I'll come back to that. But from what I could find, and that's a little book that the Karnataka government produced, and I think this sums it up. I know it's a little I'll read it out to you. The imposition of the above agreements, 1892 and 1924, can be seen as the revenge taken by the British paramountcy on the erstwhile rulers of Karnataka. The legacy of the British government enforcing the above agreements on the princely state of Karnataka is a clear deprivation of legitimate right of the farmers of the state to utilize their fair share of Kaveri waters, and therefore the said agreements are ab initio void, and in any case not maintainable after 1974 when the agreement in 1924 expired. Now, all of that, there's legal analysis, I'm sure that can be done on it, but that's the principal basis for the thing. Now, when I started researching Albion, Banerji, Manual, and I went around looking at some oral histories, everyone, I met about 7 or 8 people, instant reaction is, oh that thug, oh that rascal, the man who sold us out. It's only that. There was one side story who said, oh my great-grandfather should have become Vice-Chancellor of Mysore University, which by the way was the first university set up outside of British India in 1917. It celebrates 100 years this year, Mysore University. But the first Vice-Chancellor of Mysore University was a man Banerji brought in from Calcutta. His name was Acharya Brajendranath C. Rajatantra Pravina Acharya Brajendranath C. But the Mysorean was denied. One more reason to say outsider. So that is actually the universal thing, and I find that strange because how I should say it's a contrast. You have a road in Cochin named after it, but here, wow, the two men who are despised are him and Sardar and Kantaraj us. Now, just a few weeks ago, I was in Tanjavur with this man, Mr. Raghunathan, who was the man who fought for the Kaveri downstream, the lower riparian. In the case, Vikram will remind me the name in 91, where that led to the interim order of 91 when Bangalore burnt. Rahul is here, he will tell you what happened in Bangalore in 91. And so I met him. But you know what, and there's another Chief Secretary of Karnataka, Christopher Lynn, who told me that these two gentlemen came very close to solving the Kaveri problem in 1976, just 2 years after the 1974 agreement came to an end. That, by the way, is Babu Jagjeevan Ram, right? Who was Union Minister for Agriculture and Irrigation, 74-77, during the time of the emergency. And that, on the man on the, can anyone identify the man on the left? Same man. D. Devarajas, a descendant of Sardar and Kantarajas. He had come to power in 72 and had established himself because he broke the back of the Vokkaligara agitation in Karnataka. And he saw in 1976 an option to finally put to bed the Kaveri issue. And Christopher Lynn told me, he said, we were within kissing distance of an agreement with Madras. He was willing to compromise even more than 1924 because he felt that he had the political capital to do it. But the problem was in 76-77, Madras Tamil Nadu went through a spell of president's rule. And the man who was governor of Madras that time was the former chief minister of Rajasthan called Mohanlal Sukhadia. And so these are all Congress buddies. Devarajas and Mohanlal Sukhadia negotiating. Sukhadia pulled up short in 76. He said, Christopher Lynn telling me, saying he was private secretary to the chief minister at the time, D. Devarajas. He said, Mohanlal Sukhadia said, I don't think I have the backing. I must wait for an elected government in Madras before we can take a decision. That happened a year later, 77. And for some reason it never happened. So it is surprising that you have a descendant of Sardar and Kantarajas. And the man, from my perspective at least, is the clear epitome. I mean, if you put Babu Jagjeevan Ram back into Mysore in the 20s, he'd be the classic anti-Brahmin, right? And so you have this whole story that I'm sure there's something to be told about it. But they came closest to doing this now. So when finally Banerji was ousted in 2068, he was forced to leave, literally, by a combination of factors. I think the Mysore Maharaja was particularly disgruntled with him in the way in which he handled the negotiation. felt he had sold the state short. But it wasn't the end, by the way, of Banerjee's career. Diwan of Cochin, Diwan of Mysore, 27, he's now a retired man. He becomes foreign and political minister in Kashmir. And that is Hari Singh, who had just taken over as king of Kashmir. And that is Hari Singh in 1947. Now, if there was ever a contrast between kings, Maharajas, between this man and Nalwadi Krishnaraj Wadiyar, it's chalk and cheese. Because he was hardly in his state. He was mostly partying away in Europe. And that was always the credit. And in fact, within a year and a half, Banerjee quits in a huff, saying, Your Highness, if you will bother to kindly come back to your state, I can tell you how to govern it. But he resigns in 1929, in a real huff. He makes a press statement of 1929, where he says the state of Jammu and Kashmir is a victim of all sorts of injustices. The majority of its population comprises Muslim who are treated as dumb-driven cattle. There is no liaison between the masses and the administration. Now, obviously the king is not happy. He is a very trusted confidant to the British. And Banerjee is sidelined completely after that. He is now regarded as some kind of maverick at the age of 58. But there is one man who is listening to him. That is Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah credits Banerjee with something. The statement was made neither by a Muslim nor by one hostile to the government of India or the government of Kashmir. No one could asperse on Banerjee's sense of responsibility. And he said, I felt galvanized into action. I started bracing myself up for the coming struggle. Sheikh Abdullah actually has a chapter in his autobiography, The Blazing Chinar, Chinar, calling it Sir Albion's expose and how it galvanized him. So I went to end, I know I've really gone on, it's covered a huge wide range of things. In 1929, Banerjee moves to the UK, seeks admission, by the way, into the House of Commons. He tries to get a ticket on Conservative, which is why he smooches to the former Secretary of State for India, this Marcus Zetland, but is unsuccessful. He comes back to Bangalore because I know that for a fact. The Century Club, which was started by Sir Vishwesvaraya as a response to Indians not being allowed into the social clubs, had Banerjee as the 3rd and 11th president. He was president of Century Club in the year India gained independence. He wrote several books, 8 books. I've just started going through them. And they're quite radical views about how India should become more of a federated union. And this is another big debate that occurred at that time. Should India be a federation, a dominion, or do we go down the route which ultimately went down, which was nationalism? So, kind of he dies in 1959. Probably, I know that he dies in 1950 because Thacker's Indian Directory records his death. But I'm trying to figure out some family connections as to where he perhaps was buried. Brahmo, probably buried maybe in Bangalore or in Calcutta. I'm not too sure. But kind of the trail runs cold. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm sorry if I covered a wide spectrum. There was some very interesting facets of that. One little further thought about the collector Ash assassination. I was shocked. I said, this man is the same batch. And they were probably good friends for all you know. And although by that time he was already Diwan in Cochin. Now I started reading a little more about collector Ash. And there's another little quirk which I found. We live in Nandi Hills, just outside Bangalore. And the chief conspirator in the collector Ash, the man who committed the assassination, Banchi, killed himself, right? So the British could only try the conspirators, and there were about 20 of them who were tried. The chief conspirator was a guy called Neelakanta Brahmachari, right? Who was convicted for conspiracy, spent 9 years in one of the jails here. And then when he was let out, he assumed an ascetic and lived as Omkar Swami in Nandi Hills. So I mean, I don't know whether he's talking to me from the grave or what, I don't know. You have a man who was his batchmate, killed by someone who I now have seen the grave near my house. Right? So it's, I don't know, it's a little creepy at times because we actually saw that. I don't have a photograph of it. It actually talks about Krantikari, Neelakanta Brahmachari, Omkar Swami, Swatantrakali Horadiru, one who fought for Indian independence, buried in Nandi. And he was the conspirator to this man's the killing of this man's batsman. So, I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
Fascinating lecture. So I have a question, Albion, because I was visiting the Fort Cochin Royal Palace Museum. There was this extremely handsome man whom I initially thought it's a much younger picture of him in Fort Cochin Royal Museum, whom I actually mistook for a British gentleman, and I saw this name, Albion Banerji, Diwan of Mysore. So later when I was looking through the net and so on, I saw obscure references to the fact that there was some mutterings in Cochin State at that time that he was probably used by the British to engineer the application of the thing at that time. So I was just wondering whether you have any...
Yeah, I know that there is a reference that I've also come across to how, but truth be told, the king's abdication, the thought that he would abdicate, arose some decade or so before, even before Banerji became Diwan. So I don't think he was the cause of it. He may have assisted the king going. In fact, that reference is to how it's the king's going and shortly thereafter he resigns and demits office as Diwan of Cochin. It's not unkeeping with the man, by the way, from what I could sense. You clearly have an empire man who wants to spread the gospel. I mean, in his case, it's actually a pretty ironic word because it's really the gospel of the British Empire, because they are themselves confused as being, there are references to Banerji as being a Christian author. Right? Brahmo, Christian, the jump from being Brahmo to Christian is not very far. It can be made, and it's made usually to say you Brahmo, you Christian, you anti-Brahmin, that kind of a thing. So it's not unusual. But I have my doubts as to whether he was directly responsible. Ultimately, the reason for the Cochin Maharaja going was his belief that he wanted to spend some time meditating. Right? And I think its nationalist historian subsequently was saying, I doubt a king would have gone for that reason. It must have been engineered. So I don't know. Now, in the telling of this history, especially with the overlap of nationalist way of looking at things, the nationalist view of history, some of these issues get colored. But one thing is for sure, the idea that he would abdicate actually was there in official papers in 1905. So even before Banerji is even considered, the king wants to go. So he's certainly not the cause for Oliniwadiya Kamro of 1914. Yes, sir.
You dealt with the Kaveri dispute very well from an archival point of view, but I wonder whether you had consulted Sanjeev Guhan's work on the Kaveri dispute.
It's on my list. I have to.
Where he refers to the detailed negotiations and how finally there was a trade-off between power and water, and therefore, even the British India office was very much in favor of Tamil Nadu getting water, and they tilted the balance in favor of Tamil Nadu. But finally, they could resolve the dilemma or the conflict only by offering power to Mysore. So it was some kind of a fight.
Do you have a copy of that? That's the critical.
It is a wonderful study, though, because it runs only to 40 pages, but he had done remarkable work going into river valley agreements, international agreements.
I need to try and get a copy of it. I know about it, but it's elusive.
It will give a different dimension or an alternative dimension to what you are doing.
Just this morning, just to give you some context, I was at the C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer Foundation, where of course there's this book by Dr. Saroja Sundarajan. I think it's interesting, one thing, it says, the most heartening feature of the prolonged parleys were the friendly atmosphere in which they were conducted and the spirit of compromise displayed by both governments. Now, when you talk of spirit of compromise in 1924, the arbitration of 1913, which led to the agreement in 1924, was actually an arbitration that was decided in favor of the Mysore government. So the arbitrator had ruled in favor. So as far as the legal position goes, the arbitrator award was in favor of Mysore. But the 1924 agreement reverses a lot of that.
But the political equilibrium...
That's it. And that's where he comes into the picture.
Political equilibrium was what one would call
precisely
a Nash equilibrium.
That's right. It's between the vassal and the paramount power. And he's kind of seen as having aided that process. Of course, the what if...
Ultimately, Banerji was only a vassal. He did not have a major role.
No, absolutely. He was at best, yeah, you're right. A stooge would probably be a better word.
Very interesting talk. Just curious to know, why did he choose to study Tamil for these civil service exam, being from Bengali? That's what brought him here.
I don't know actually. No, I don't know, because I actually, when I knew that he was a member of the Madras Presidency. No, that's true. But he could have opted for his cadre, and it would have been natural for him to have opted for the Bengal presidency. Because I would have thought you're right, but there's nothing there. Only a reference to his marks, and yeah, he just chose it. Maybe I don't know. It's also a sense of an outsider, right? He's kind of fits it. I think there's another facet, and I'm just starting to read about the Brahmos. Today, I think there are only a handful of people who you would call Brahmos left, right? But in the turn of that century, the 19th going into the 20th, there's a very significant influence. But even Bengali society is reacting to them, right? And so there might well have been a movement to, push them out. I don't know. I'm still reading through. It's a fascinating history, by the way, because there's one author who's done it's a guy called, American professor by the name of David Kopf. It's called The Brahmo and the Making of the Modern Indian Mind. His thesis is that the idea of India, and that's why Raja Roman Roy is called the father of modern India, right? That the idea of a forward-looking country comes from that. That's David Kopf's conclusion. He's, by the way, someone who's much revered, I know. There's an institute in Calcutta called the Institute for Historical Studies, which does a lot of propagation of David Kopf's work. And this is the central thesis of it, that the Brahmos did a lot of good, but as a result, were kind of pushed away. Perhaps, I don't know. We'll see.
I think that's
Before the voter banks, you got me interested at the beginning itself. Because it's something I've been adding as a footnote wherever I get the opportunity, and sometimes talking of it separately. What I call autobiography or biography as history.
Say that again, sir, sorry.
Autobiography or biography as history. That's what we're talking about, but I've been doing it for a long time now. And my theory on this has been, and some have followed it, every one of us has a story to tell. Every one of us has gone through a period of life or experience which needs to be recorded. And you record it not necessarily for publication, but at least for your children or your grandchildren to know about the times you lived in. And many people have followed this exercise. Some have had their stuff published. For instance, there is a man called Mr. Rajan who followed this and did it, and you get a very fine picture of advertising in Madras and in the south in India. These are the other information that you get out of history as such. We record our lives. And this is my appeal always. Put down 500 words every day. About your life.
Diary. I don't know where his diaries are. I'm sure he might have.
Put down 500 words of the life you lived in. For instance, if I ever sat and wrote about my life in Ceylon, it will give you a totally different picture from what is happening these days. So this is where it's very important, I think, that all of us need to record our lives as such and hand it over either for publication if possible or much better to your children and grandchildren. Go to it from now, 500 words every day.
There's one, very interesting little footnote again to your footnote, sir. When I started looking at this early on, I realized that there's actually very little written about the Indian ICS officers. There are accounts and memoirs of the English ICS officers, several of them, across different times and different eras and different states. But the Indian civil services officers, very little written. And the first man and Vikram will bear me out here, is our first election commissioner, Sukumar Sen, 1952 or 57. He conducted an election in 57 that was cheaper to run than the 52 election because he kept the ballot boxes intact for 5 years. He was an ICS man. Nothing written about it. We don't know where his personal papers are. I'm sure they exist somewhere scattered. I'm actually trying to track down family, and I know I'm getting close by. Not directly related, not blood. I mean, in the sense it's through his Banerji's wife and that side of the family. Is Dr. Ashok Chatterjee, the former director of the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, is his grandnephew. And I asked him, he says, "Oh la la, my family is a very confused family. I have an Iyengar maternal grandfather who I know nothing about." He says, "Perhaps it's because of him that I actually managed to complete some work, because of Bengali in me which will never get me far." So, you know, and so there's a lot of that. It's very interesting because it's a, look at the family is much, you know, I didn't mention, it's a side story here. Walter Dutt, his son-in-law, actually participated on the side of the left, the communists, in the Spanish Civil War. He spent 6 months in Madrid. His son-in-law. And then he comes back as Advocate General of CP in Berar and dies because he's driven, must have been drunk, must have driven his car into a, as he says, Justice Siddarth says, he drove it up a tree and killed himself. Komalata Dutt moved to Allahabad, and the last I know of her is that she was seen and recognized and brought to Delhi by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And I'm going to Ahmedabad in 2 weeks. I have the rare honor of meeting, keep my fingers crossed that I will get a chance, to meet Guru Kumudini Lakhya, who owes her introduction to Kathak to his daughter. There's fascinating stories of across, and you know, this is, I'm going to Nagpur and to Ahmedabad to try and ferret some information out.
Now, may I invite Mr. G. Sundar to provide a word of thanks.
I'd like to, this is a fantastic evening lecture. Thank you, Siddarth, and what do I say, is keeping all this spellbound and get the audience intact. And I want to thank Vikram for introducing the speaker of the evening, and not just that, also introducing you to us. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you very much. And please leave your email address and your phone numbers in case you have not already and you would like to inform about our events, lectures, and all that. And thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. And I'm so happy that I was a couple of Bengali faces here. And don't forget the 2.5 crores for Christmas. Thank you.